Let me reboot here. Thank you again for inviting me to speak to you today. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. Uh, as Keith mentioned, I have 18 dam removals to my credit, and this is probably one of the more complicated and interesting ones, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some of that with you. Uh, I'd like to begin by thanking our project partners, ODNR, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, which was the client in this case, um, our restoration team, the volunteers that we got from U.S. Fish and ODNR and others, and the various agencies, Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, which paid for the project, and other collaborating partners, not least of which was the contractor who did the work for us. Um, as always, it's a good idea to begin at the beginning. And so I'm going to run through a little bit of background to frame this up as to why it might be important to talk about this project. And I'll begin with answering the question, why are we talking about dams and dam removal in this case? And uh, I think maybe one of the most important things to recognize is that there are over 90,000 dams out there on the landscape. The little blue dots on the U.S. map on the lower right-hand corner represent the location for all those dams. And so dams have literally transformed the landscape that we live on. And they have a number of consequences that are not desirable. They trap sediment. They are migration barriers for fish. They cause thermal and chemical stratification, which can have consequences for water quality. They change the structure and function of aquatic ecosystems in ways that are not readily adaptable for a lot of species. Um, and then, in addition to that, there are human factors associated with this. They are often in poor condition. Generally speaking, the American Society for Civil Engineers generally gives dams as a whole a C or a D when they rate their quality over time. They grade them as a C or a D, which is not a desirable grade because they're generally in such poor condition and poorly maintained. Often, dams that were built long ago are obsolete or unused. They're just sitting there in the landscape. And then finally, especially low head dams, they're sometimes drowning machines. They're actually quite dangerous. And uh, a few years ago, we actually had a client drown on one of his own projects, and so it could be quite tragic. Uh, so there are lots of reasons, both ecological and human, to begin removal for some of these structures. The next question, since this talk focuses about mussels, is I thought it might be useful just to talk about mussels. What are they? Because probably most people don't know. Uh, I imagine this group is more in the know than others, but I'll touch on a few things. So they are freshwater bivalves. They sit in the substrate and filter water. They provide a lot of benefits actually for us as humans in that they do filter particles out of the water. They have ecological functions. They're food. They have gills for breathing underwater, muscles for opening their shells. You can see in the lower left-hand corner, that's a picture of a pocketbook sitting there filtering water. They can move around. They have a foot that will dig into the substrate or that can move them laterally in the channel. And they have a ligament and muscles that allow them to open and close their shell as needed. Where they live, pretty much everywhere there's water, rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, everything from little bitty streams like the one in the upper right photo, all the way down to the Mississippi River. They occupy habitats in a range of sizes and shapes. They tend to prefer sand, silt, gravel mixtures, but they will sometimes occur even in bedrock crevices or deep in sandstone fractures. And maybe and another question that I think is important to answer is, why do we care? They're just these little things that sit on the bottom of the river. Do we really need to care? And I think the answer to that is yes. Uh, One reason is that there are approximately 300 species in North America. This, where we live, is the global hotspot for this particular faunal group. There are more here than any place else in the world, and 37 of those species are already thought to be extinct. Another 73 are critically imperiled, and even and more continue to be added to the special status lists over time. And in fact, I'm aware of at least 5 species that were added to the endangered species list under the U.S. Endangered Species Act just this summer. And I'm certain that I don't know of all of them. So um, there, from a conservation perspective, there's a real and critical need to try to conserve these species. And another reason that we might care about them, or at least for nerdy biologists like myself, is they're actually kind of cool. Um, there is a really interesting life history strategy that they use where they must parasitize a fish host in order to complete their reproductive cycle. And in order to do that, they have all these crazy adaptations. One of which, I don't know if you're actually seeing that little box there, but they come up with lures that trick fish into biting them. So the lower left photo here is something that's intended to look like a fish or a crayfish, probably more fish-like. It's got a little eye spot on it. These little packages here contain the babies, and this particular species, the wavy-rayed lamp mussel, parasitizes bass. When a bass comes up to eat that, it explodes in the mouth of the fish, and they wind up with little gochidia all over their gills. This is an example of uh, what's called a conglutinate, and this little thing is designed to look like a larval fish. It has eye spots, and within this package are little baby fish, or little baby mussels. Another crazy thing that they do is they actually catch fish. So this mussel is the oyster mussel, which is a federally endangered one. It's got a little lure here. When fish comes up to hit that lure, the valves actually close on the fish, and it has sort of a bellows where it'll snap down on the head and pump glucidia over the top of the fish. If we wind up with a little bit of extra time and there's interest, I'll show you a video when I'm done that'll just pickle your brain of that exact behavior. But very cool animals, I think. So I think it's also important to talk a little bit about background and to uh, think about project life history. Uh, so the dam was built in 1830. It was part of the Erie-Walhonda Canal. Um, the there was a lock chamber at this particular dam that connected it to various places, and the canal ran all the way up to from Warsaw, Ohio, all the way up to uh, Cleveland, essentially to connect with the Erie Canal. Horses pulled barges along the shoreline, and it was a way to move commerce and people and other things. Canal was abandoned in 1896. In 1909, it was modified to put a hydro facility on it. That ran for about 40 years and was discontinued in the 50s. And then the dam sat idle for until roughly around 2010, when the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the owner, began to become concerned about the condition of the dam and what it might mean if it were to fail. They commissioned a few studies, a mussel survey, an underwater inspection, and we were contracted to do a feasibility study to look at options for repair or removal. Um, Fast forward through lots of regulatory process and design and permitting and other things to 2020. So 8 years later, construction on the dam to remove it began. So again, uh, just as we started our feasibility study, we knew these things. The dam was built in the 30s, was in poor condition. There were adjacent landowners there that had a strong emotional attachment to the dam. Two campgrounds that were heavily utilized. People got married at the base of the dam. Um, so a lot of attachment to the structure and the place setting. And then also that there were two federally listed mussels that were present in the dam pool. These were the things that we knew. So as we began our work on trying to understand what the ultimate disposition of this structure would be, we dug into things a little bit more, and we really discovered how poor condition the dam was in. It was very old, obviously, since it was built in the 1830s. It was a timber crib with a concrete cap, which was a common construction technique in those days. And you can actually see the timbers encased in the concrete here. This is a photo we took during the demolition. But um, the dam was settling and had significant cracks in it. And you can actually see this is a photo that was also taken during demolition, but you can see where it had settled so low that the water only covered part of the dam, and that's just because of the cracks and the settling that occurred. There were voids extending 13 feet underneath the downstream face of the dam, and so really this was a structure that could have failed at any moment in response to a big storm. And in this case, it probably wasn't going to result in loss of life, but a lot of dams on the landscape, if they fail, people die. So again, it was eligible for the historic register, um, and you can see some of these are works associated with opening and closing the gates. This is the lock structure that was now out of water and filled in with wetlands, but this was also part of the locking structure that the horses and the barges moved through. Um, this was the campground. Another focal point of the project design objective that we had to incorporate was that there was uh, bank erosion associated with the dam and changes to the sediment supply dynamics that was causing erosion that was, and the channel was laterally migrating toward the campground and to structures that people have up on the banks. And so that was something that we needed to address. Uh, their sediment management is probably one of the most important things to do uh, anytime that you're working with a dam, whether it's repair or removal. And I just wanted to throw some slides up from some other projects that we've had over the years, just to give you a little bit of context. So the first one is a dam that was called West Milton Dam on the Stillwater River in Ohio. And the dash line is kind of the historic riverbed, the inferred historic riverbed, and the solid line is top of sediment. And generally speaking, these dams trap fine sediment. They're very, very good at it. And uh, oftentimes, this is a technique that we use to assess that. You can see for the West Milton Dam that it's actually storing very little sediment, and that is likely a function of the material that is delivered by the watershed. The next dam down, the middle graphic, is Ballville Dam on the Sandusky River in Fremont, Ohio. And you can see that's a very different story there. That dash line for the inferred bed is much lower than the top of sediment. And in fact, we estimated that this dam was storing about 840,000 cubic yards. So quite a bit of sediment. 6 Mile Dam, the one that we're talking about today, is at the bottom. And you can see that it's actually, well, first, the thing that you can see is that it's actually small in comparison to some of the others, but you can also see that it's actually full. Um, the the sediment is filled all the way up, about halfway up the dam. The bed is roughly level with the inferred bed, the historic bed, and uh, and so that has implications for how we manage the removal. So one of the things that we did was characterize the sediment. I guess I should also say that sediment quantity is can be a big management problem, but sediment quality is also another problem. And I've worked on a few of these over the years where we've had contaminated sediments, and there's nothing that will make your project costs spin out of control so quickly as contaminated sediment. And it's just a much more difficult thing to maintain and to address. And so the first thing we always do is try to get a handle on those two things. Fortunately for us, the sediment sampling that we did here determined that there were no contaminants of concern. That's always a huge relief for project proponents. And also, we did some probings to try to get a handle on how much soft sediment that there was. And to our surprise, there was very little. If you look at the Ponar grabs, so these are just sort of a spring-loaded clamshell that collects sediments on the bottom. Most of this material up in here was really mineral substrate, so gravel, sands, those kinds of things. As you move down in the impoundment, you start to pick up a little more sand. And then in some of these areas down here, we did pick up some silty, fine sediments. And in fact, sediment thickness in some of these areas was 8 feet almost, like right here. But generally speaking, in comparison to other projects that we worked on, there was very little sediment. One thing I want to do is highlight this orange boundary here, and I'm just going to ask you to take a snapshot of that in your mind, because we're going to come back to this and talk about it in just a little bit. There's some really interesting stuff that's happening there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of the project. I put this photo of the rabbit's foot, which is a federally threatened mussel, here to remind myself to talk about this, because um, the listed mussels featured in nearly every component of the project uh, as we put down the design. And I guess I should also say uh, it was clear to us after looking at the information that I just presented there that it was going to be really difficult to repair that dam in a cost-effective way. And in practice, it often turns out to be much cheaper to uh, remove dams than it is to repair them. And this was certainly the case for this project. Once the decision was made to remove, uh, we started thinking about design criteria, and mussels were one that featured prominently in the design. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looked like and how we moved forward. So this is the overview. Again, this is that little island that I referenced earlier on this kind of dash line. You can see the bifurcated channel that splits around. The dam is here. Uh, we have a staging area up here for all of our heavy equipment and materials. So we brought in rock, uh, plant materials. Everything was staged up here. We moved down along the levee to access the channel. The dam was demolished by installing a causeway across the channel, and then track hose moved in and started pecking on it with pneumatic hammers. The abutments and lock walls were all removed. We had originally hoped to keep those for historical purposes, but the walls were so tall, and without the presence of the dam, we were really concerned that it was going to fall and that it wouldn't be stable. And so ultimately, all of these things were removed. Another element of the project was to install bank stabilization along these areas, which really consisted of kind of bioengineered techniques, wood toe sod mats, and a little bit of riprap here and there, but for the most part, trying to do more of a natural touch on this. As I said, um, the because mussels figured so prominently in the project, we knew that there was going to have to be a mussel rescue when we drained the bathtub, so to speak. And at this point, we've probably, my company at this point, when we started this project, we'd probably done a half dozen or so where we had removed dams and found thousands of mussels in the upstream dam pools. And so we knew that that was going to be the case here. And not only that, but we knew that some of those mussels were going to be federally listed. And so, as part of the Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act, one of the things that we had to do was come up with a plan to rescue and relocate the mussels out of harm's way. As part of the design for the project, we wanted to implement something that would minimize adverse effects to mussels to the maximum extent possible. And one of the things that happens sometime, generally, the way that these rescues are performed is that people walk around and it's kind of like a big Easter egg hunt, where you get a bunch of volunteers, you walk around the exposed banks, you pick up mussels, put them in baskets, move them into water for temporary storage, process them, ID them, move them to a different location, and that's the end of the story. Uh, One of the things that happens sometimes, though, is if you remove the dam in one fell swoop, you can actually overwhelm your search crews uh, by exposing so far more mussels than you can collect. And we want to limit time that they're exposed to the air. Obviously, they're aquatic organisms, and that's not good for them. And so, what we did in this case was propose a two-stage design where uh, a small notch was made in the dam, and then we completed whatever searching we were going to do on phase one, and then removed the rest of the dam down to grade. And I'll show you some pictures of what that looks like. Another thing that we did is mussels survive better when they're not out baking in the sun. So we timed the project so that it was implemented in the cooler months of the year so that they would stay moist and cool and wet. Um, and that was another feature of our overall project design. This is a picture of some sheepnose, which are federally endangered. Talk a little bit about the permit cycle for this. Um, there are nationwide permits for dam removal now, nationwide 53, which is intended to make it easy to do a good thing. Um, in this case, because of the federally listed mussels present, we also had to do a 401 water quality certification, um, and because of the unusual, the high quality designation for the wall hunting in this particular place, we had to complete Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act consultation, which involved donating some of these older structures to a local historical society. And as I said earlier, we had to complete formal consultation under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, which involved preparation of biological assessment and the services preparing a biological opinion and incidental take authorization. I also mentioned that we did rescue and relocation upstream of the dam, but we also had to do one downstream. And this is the construction footprint. So my crew and I spent 8 days covering every inch of the bottom here, um, where the colored lines are, the polygons are. I think we found something like 45 mussels, which was really a low number, and in part that is because of the effects of the dam and trapping the sediments that are trapped upstream. Um, we also did the rescue upstream, and in this case, we set up different search cells and kept track of how many mussels were coming from what areas. And the idea was that we had to deplete them to a proportion of the number we found on the initial search. So we just kept searching and searching and searching until we had achieved basically depletion in each of those search cells. So we'll talk a little bit about implementation now. Um, the This is a picture of the trackhoe uh, working on the notch for the dam, and another one. So you can see that that first phase one drawdown is showing up there. You can also see some of the cracks in the dam here, where it had settled over time. And in fact, you can, even from this photo, from this distance, you can tell that this part of the dam is quite a bit lower. So not a good situation. And then when we moved on to the phase two drawdown, at this point, we essentially have a free flowing river because we have over there on the right hand side have really lowered it down to its final grade and elevation. And you can see from the deposits that are up here in the shade on the channel, those exposed sediments, those are places where mussels were exposed, and these are areas that we ended up searching. So I mentioned earlier, I think we found after 8 days of searching, we found 45 live animals downstream of the dam. We found 12,000 mussels upstream, and uh, to our great surprise, we found 632 federally threatened rabbit's foot and 127 federally endangered sheep nose. And you know, generally the fauna that we see in some of these impoundments is one that is opportunistic and adapted for altered conditions. But in this case, uh, we actually had a pretty good assemblage, 24 species and a whole bunch of federally listed mussels, which was, I think, surprising to everyone. We knew that they were there, but we didn't know that they were going to be so numerous. Uh, One of the things that, so this is kind of a nerdy thing, but these are length distributions for each of the species. And when people like me who do this for on a regular basis look at these, one of the things that you see is near continuous recruitment for the species, meaning that this is a healthy, well balanced community that's replacing itself. There are some species that are kind of skewed toward older individuals. That actually happens depending on the different life histories, but generally speaking, this is a really good sign. And uh, the mussel populations were doing pretty well. Um, this is us where I took a picture of the mussels being loaded into a truck. We're ready to go. Some people are surprised that we leave them out of water like this, but they actually do just fine. Um, the the top chart here is overall abundance, so just simple counts by location. And one of the things that you can see, and this will be a repeated theme, is that there are certain places where we continue to find lots of mussels, and then there are other places where we find very few. You'll notice that close to the dam, in the place that's really most impounded, we didn't find all that many. And up here, we didn't find very many either in the free flowing reach. That's not because they weren't there. There are tons of mussels in the river. It's just that we didn't. This was the limit of the drawdown, and the river just didn't change very much in this part of the in this in these search cells. But 22 species in one cell is pretty crazy, and a very impressive result. If we look at the two listed species, so this is rabbit's foot, we got 180 of them right here. Um, for sheep nose, they seem to like this cell a little better, although they were here too. And you can see that in these areas adjacent to the dam, we just didn't find them. And that's likely because of the habitat alteration. I thought it'd be useful just to kind of show you some pictures of the most productive search cells. So this photo up here on the upper left is this orange cell right here. And in reality, this was almost a riffle to begin with, which riffles don't really occur in dam pools by definition. And to a large degree, this habitat up here, even though the elevation changed when we drained the bathtub, uh, it didn't change all that much. And there were high velocities, there were um, uh, coarse mineral substrates and complex hydraulic currents, things that mussels need. There were the right substrate sizes, so it's mostly gravel and sand. And you can see from the line here that it didn't really change that much. Whereas you can compare contrast the orange photo at the bottom, you can see that there was probably about, oh, this is a person who's 6 feet tall, let's say. So there's probably about 8 feet of stage change at this particular location, whereas maybe here there might have been 2 or 3 feet, two maybe. Same thing here. And this big exposed point bar just upstream of the island was super productive. Just had the right combination of substrate size, hydraulics, and cover and fish species, and it was kind of the sweet spot. I want to compare what we found in this project to another project that is more typical of what we see when we do these dam removals. Um, Believe it or not all mussels are super rare or super sensitive. In fact, some of them are what I refer to as kind of weedy. They're like the dandelions of the Uniana world, and they love impoundments. They love human altered environments. And what we typically see is that these opportunistic species in impoundments may make up as much as 100% of the assemblage. And this is the left hand side of the scale is the location of a dam. And as you move upstream, the opportunistic species uh, account for between 70 and 100% of the assemblage. But once you begin to transition into these free flowing reaches, the other species begin to take over, and the other life history strategies begin to, if not dominate, at least coexist. But this is a really clear signal of impairment associated with the dams. When we look at 6 Mile, which are the two, remember there are two threads of the channel here, we don't really see that same kind of impaired signature, which is a little bit surprising to me when I first started working up these data. I kind of intuitively knew that from spending so many days picking up mussels, but I was a little surprised by it. And I want to talk about that a little bit in a minute. I'm going to table that for just a second. Um, so that was the implementation phase of the project. There is monitoring and adaptive management that occurs. Um, and so one of the things that we had to do was monitor post post relocation survival for the listed mussels. So we ended up tagging them and putting passive integrated transponders on them, and which is kind of like a barcode reader that you take out in the field. And so we had to relocate mussels that we had moved to monitor survival, and I'm happy to report that they did very well. Um, there, there are other things that go on associated with this that I'm not going to talk about, but sometimes there are channel adjustments. In this case, we did have some lateral movement because of changes in sediment supply. And so if you're doing a project like this, you have to pay attention to that. And just because you're done with the demolition doesn't necessarily mean you're done with the project. Um, Wanted to talk a little bit more about the overall context of the project. And, you know, one of the questions I've gotten when I've given this talk before as well if there were so many mussels, why were you doing this? And I'm going to come around to that in a minute in the long way. So stick with me for a minute. But I do think that so these are some of the other projects that we've done over the years. Um, and one of the things that you'll see, so I have impoundment length and rescue counts, number of mussels per mile. CPUE is catch per unit effort. So that's like how many mussels did you find per hour of searching, and then species count. And one of the things that you'll notice from this list is that this project 6 Mile was really an exceptional project in by any metric that you use. Uh, we produced it. It produced a ton of mussels. Um, they were very abundant in terms of number found per unit effort, and it also produced the most species. So again, the question why, um, and I'm still coming to it. Earlier, the we had talked about. I'd showed you that orange polygon where the island was, and you can see the island here. Yeah, this is a photo that was taken around 1900 something, and my understanding is that it was associated with the construction of the hydro project. And one of the things that you see here is that there is no island. And so, in just under 100 years' time, we had this huge island form and become forested. And this has implications for uh, what we saw in the impoundment. Um, this is a drainage area, cross sectional area for the channel curve. It's something our restoration engineers use when they're designing channels. And I thought it would be a useful way to just kind of illustrate what had happened in this project over time. The You can see the solid squares are the cross sectional areas of the channels when the projects were built. And one of the things that you see, this is a relationship that says if you've got 1,000 square miles, your cross sectional area should fall on this channel, on this line, somewhere close. And when they were built, what happens is that they don't really fit the overall trend line. But between 1903 for Ballville Dam and 1993, uh, these red dots, as the dam began to fill, it began to evolve to fit more with what it wanted to be originally before someone put a dam on it. The same thing with 6 Mile Dam, solid dots, open dots, much closer to the curve. And I think it's important to note that these things do evolve over time, and that has implications for what you find in the channel. And again, this is a more detailed look at what I presented earlier. Um, and the thing that you can see with this is actual uh, bed forms. So riffles and pools, riffles and pools and sequences like you would normally find in a free flowing river, as opposed to, excuse me, excuse me, in an impoundment. Um, and so coming back around to if there are so many mussels, why are you doing this? The answer is the downstream reach. And if you'll remember, so this is the dam site used to set right here. You can still see the hoe sitting up there in the river on the causeway. But immediately after we began this project, or after the demolition was completed, the river started doing what it was supposed to do, which was to transport gravel, sand, desirable substrates downstream. And what we're expecting is going to happen is that once we've restored this natural process, these defaunated habitats that were downstream of the dam are now going to have the things that the mussels need to live and thrive and survive. And in essence, what we've done as part of this project is restore a necessary natural process for that will lead to recolonization of mussels and habitats that were formerly unoccupied. I think it's also important to note that uh, dam failure is a thing. It's real. And I think it was 2 years ago, there were two big dams that failed in Michigan that made all the national news. There are undocumented failures that happen every year. And I think it's important to think about these with respect to um, other human and non human uh, features on the landscape. And for example, if this dam were to have failed in January, uh, when there's ice on, what we would have had would have been 12,000 dead mussels because they would be frozen. And so that would have been an adverse impact that was avoidable for something that was a really valuable resource. And so, and sometimes when these dams fail, people get hurt or killed. Um, and there's reason to do this in a controlled versus in an uncontrolled way. Another thing to consider about this is that, there are funds available to remove dams, uh, but there's seldom funds available for repair. I think Michigan actually has a program where they will help, but generally speaking, as a society, repair and maintenance is not something that we pay for, and there are thousands of dams out there on the landscape for which no one is really taking responsibility, and they're just sitting there waiting for the day when the infrastructure can no longer sustain itself. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions if people have them and we have time.
Thank you so much. That was outstanding and illuminating in many ways. I really appreciate, and I'm sure we all appreciate that. And I'm going to jump in with a question while others can take the time to write a question into the chat if you have it. And I actually have two questions, Cody. The first question is, in the very beginning, you shared a timeline,
Mm-hmm.
and in that timeline were some public meetings, and I'm just curious about the public sentiment about this in terms of you mentioned some emotional connections to the dam because of weddings and that sort of thing. Were there also any emotional connections in favor of removing the dam, and what did that look like?
Yeah, we generally get it on both sides. The I've yet to do one of these where someone hasn't yelled at me at some point. Actually, I take that back. This was the first one where I'd never had anybody yell at me. And oftentimes, partially because we're very visible when we're doing the muscle work afterwards, they tend to take their frustrations out on us. But generally speaking, there is a lot of support, and we get lots of volunteers that come out and are really excited about it. Folks who paddle, uh, but the folks that uh, generally it's the folks that live right there. I mean, they love the place that they live, and it's understandable. Like, I 100% understand why they're so frustrated with it. Um, and it is a hard change is hard for everyone. Um, Generally, what we find though over time is that some of that begins to go away. They begin to appreciate uh, the new river for what it is, and I think actually they tend to fish better after the dams are out. Uh, the habitat is not super great. It's often anoxic, which is not good for fish. But that said, um, it it can be quite contentious sometimes, and uh, we do public meetings as part of these a lot, and it can it can be heated at times. Uh, so it it's something that people have strong feelings about either way.
Thank you. That's really interesting, for sure. And I have one more question, which is about uh, well, when you have 12,000 mussels that you're moving to another part of the river, I know you
Mm-hmm.
monitor them after they're moved. Um, You may have mentioned this, but I don't know how you decide where you're moving them to, and how they might impact the other mussels that might already be in that neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, those are excellent questions. Um, we do a lot of work for that. You know, we spent days out looking for suitable sites, and you know, in this profession, there are some generally accepted rules of thumb for how you don't want to exceed certain densities, because if you begin to exceed the carrying capacity, they can become food limited. Uh, you know, generally speaking, you don't want to increase the resident density over 2 times its current density. And what we do is uh, track that over time, and we keep track of the stats. We know how many we're moving and where. In this case, also because we had so much riverine habitat, really, uh, a lot of them we ended up just moving down slope as opposed to moving them to some other place. One thing we worry about sometimes with that is that the channel is going to adjust to the new condition, and the mussels might be swept downstream or destabilized or buried. In this case, we didn't worry about that as much because of what we were seeing when the bathtub was drained, and so we just moved them down slope.
Very interesting. Well, we're now out of time, but I will say the crowd is cheering. Thank you very much for your wise words and this really interesting story, and also the many stories about various dams and how this has happened. I think it's painted a really interesting picture for what is possible, and as we are considering that in various spots around North Carolina right now, this is very timely. So really appreciate your insights. And I have more questions, but since I know who you are, I'll find you. And if other questions pop up, I'll bring them to you. You've come a long way since your budding days as a fluviogeomorphologist, which I used to love to say. And it's really great to see you doing this amazing work. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
You can't hear the crowd going
Happy to
wild,
be
but I can.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.